Welcome to The Explainer. I am so excited to have you with us today, because honestly, we are embarking on a truly fascinating journey together. We're going to trace what you might call the blueprint of exploitation. We'll be looking at how this massive, globe-spanning extractive machinery, engineered by 15th century colonial empires, how it didn't just vanish when those empires fell. No, it evolved. We'll see exactly how it morphed into the domestic tax systems and elite structures that quietly but very firmly govern modern states today. Okay, let's just dive right into this.
To really understand this blueprint, we first got to define what it is we're actually looking at. It's called elite capture. Basically, this happens when a tiny faction or maybe a coalition of interest groups mechanically infiltrates the state apparatus. And, they aren't doing this for the greater good. They're doing it to maximize their own factional economic gains. When they pull this off, the nation transitions from an autonomous state, one that actually serves its people, into a captive state, serving only those elites.
So, here's our roadmap for today. 1. Understanding the elite framework. 2. The 5 colonial empires. 3. Mechanics of colonial extraction. 4. Elite capture and taxation. 5. Modern elite dynamics focusing on Pakistan. And finally, 6. Reversing the blueprint.
Section 1. Understanding the elite framework.
Before we look at history, we really have to understand what exactly an elite is from a sociological perspective. The Italian sociologist Vilfredo Pareto categorized that tiny fraction of society that actually holds power into 2 really distinct psychological types. On the left, we've got the lions. These are the elites who rule through pure force, tradition, and authority. They absolutely value stability above all else. Then, on the right, you have the foxes. Foxes govern through cunning, manipulation, and innovation. Pareto argued that history is essentially just the story of one elite group replacing another, constantly cycling between these 2 modes of control, force versus manipulation.
Building on that idea, the American sociologist C. Wright Mills identified what he famously called the power elite, and he didn't describe them as some secret shadowy conspiracy in a smoke-filled room. Actually, it's more like a highly cohesive triad, corporate, military, and political directors, who all share the exact same background and worldviews. Their power flows directly from the specific, dominant institutional positions they command. This puts them in a position to make decisions with terrible, sweeping consequences for the underlying populations. This triad concept, it gives us the absolute perfect lens to view our next subject, the historical global conquerors.
Section 2. The 5 colonial empires.
Let's look at the big 5 colonial powers. Portugal with its trade monopolies, Spain with conquest and mining, the Netherlands utilizing company rule, France focusing on assimilation and resources, and Britain relying on indirect rule and strategic positioning. Now, each of these empires engineered totally unique extraction models based on their specific governance styles. Spain, for example, used highly centralized viceroyalties to aggressively mine and pull immense mineral wealth, like literal mountains of silver, out of the Americas. The Dutch, they used corporate monopolies. They basically used joint stock companies like the VOC to brutally extract commercial profit. And Britain, they mastered indirect rule, using the existing local elites to facilitate massive trade and industrial extraction. But here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. No matter the specific method, every single one of them deliberately stunted the colony's capacity to build a healthy long-term domestic tax system.
Section 3. Mechanics of colonial extraction.
To see how devastating this mechanics was, just look at the timeline of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a prime example. In 1884, it literally begins as the personal, private property of King Leopold II, where millions died just to meet his rubber and ivory quotas. Total terror. Then, from 1908 to 1960, control shifts to the Belgian state, which focuses heavily on exploiting copper and diamonds. By the time of its incredibly abrupt independence in 1960, the country had suffered an immense institutional vacuum and just extreme infrastructure neglect. The state wasn't built to be a state. It was built purely as a vehicle for taking wealth out.
And the sheer scale of this global drain, it is staggering. Let me put this into perspective. Before British colonization, the Indian subcontinent accounted for roughly 23 to 25% of the entire global economy. By the time the British left in 1947, that share had plummeted to under 4%. Through aggressive deindustrialization and heavily taxing agricultural lands, economists estimate the British drained roughly $45 trillion in wealth. Trillion! This systematic deindustrialization is the exact reason why formerly wealthy regions struggled so deeply to build self-sustaining tax bases once the empires finally packed up and left. The wealth was just gone.
Section 4. Elite capture and taxation.
Now, when those empires left, their extractive blueprint didn't just vanish into thin air. It was simply inherited.
Think of the modern captive state as a corporation. Let's call it Elites Ltd. It's basically a minority-held corporation where a few elite shareholders completely control the management, and their goal is to squeeze out the public majority. These internal factions face what scholars call the rational actor dilemma. See, they absolutely need the state to survive so they can protect and grow their wealth, but they want to sustain it at the absolute minimum cost to themselves. So what do? They treat their own state exactly like a colonial trading company.
Section 5. Modern Elite Dynamics. Pakistan.
Let's zoom in on a modern case study to see this in action. In Pakistan, Elites Ltd is run by a conglomerate of very specific factions. You've got the military elite, the industrial elite, the business elite, the feudal elite, the religious elite, and what we'll call sundry elites, which includes your media, judicial, and nonprofit professionals. Now notice who isn't driving this list: the politicians and the bureaucrats. In this model, they are acting merely as agents. Their job is just to facilitate this non-zero-sum cooperation among these dominant groups, just keeping the economic status quo running smoothly for the actual elites.
So how exactly do they pull this off? Well, they use a coldly rational tax manipulation playbook. Step 1. They shift the tax burden away from their own incomes and dump it onto the masses by relying heavily on indirect taxes. Think sales and excise taxes. Step 2, they implement extended withholding and presumptive tax regimes. Now this is a brilliant, if totally cynical move. It legally shields their own accounts from proper audits while passing the actual tax liability down the chain. And step 3, when domestic revenues inevitably fall short, because of course they do, they shift to non-tax revenues and super expensive foreign loans. They basically defer their own payments indefinitely and let the state rack up all the debt.
And the result of this playbook? Pakistan's tax collection has historically stagnated at just 8 to 9% of its GDP. And listen, this isn't an accident or mere incompetence. No way. It is a totally engineered outcome. By keeping the tax to GDP ratio artificially low, the elites ensure the nation functions only as what's called an equilibrium consensus subsistence state, basically meaning it barely scrapes by. It generates just enough to stay afloat and serve the elites, but never, ever enough to actually empower the public majority.
Section 6. Reversing the Extractive Blueprint. So what do we take away from all this? First, we have to embrace a pretty profound realization. The mechanics of exploitation are largely identical. Whether we are talking about external colonial extraction, where wealth is literally drained by force and sent to a foreign metropole, or internal elite extraction, where domestic factions use tax loopholes and indirect taxes to shift the burden to the marginalized masses, the blueprint is the exact same. It's Pareto's lions and foxes, just wearing different uniforms in different centuries.
So how do we dismantle this? Well, mere foreign aid won't work. Actually, it often just reinforces those old extractive habits of the elite. True sovereignty requires massive structural transformation. First, countries have got to retain value locally through industrialization, rather than just endlessly exporting raw materials. Second, we need to boost South-South trade, things like the African Continental Free Trade Area, to break the reliance on Western intermediaries. Third, we have to actively dismantle those heavily biased domestic institutions that only serve elites limited. And finally, global institutions like the IMF and World Bank absolutely must be reformed to end these austerity traps that just punish the marginalized while protecting elite capital.
I want to leave you with a thought to really chew on. Can our modern, globalized world truly dismantle an extractive blueprint that has been institutionalized and perfected over 500 years? Or will Pareto's circulation of elites just continue to turn the wheel, simply replacing foreign masters with domestic ones? It's a heavy question for sure, but by truly understanding the mechanics of this blueprint, we're taking the very first step toward rewriting it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the structures of power.